Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Having proper resources at work is an important idea to consider, but it's one that sometimes gets overlooked or even forgotten. Resources are those things that allow us to do our jobs, and when it comes to job-related resources specifically, oftentimes resources are thought of in terms of resources and demands. So in other words, job resources and job demands, because as logic dictates, in order for us to complete tasks at work, we require certain resources. Resources can be things such as our own skills that are required to do our jobs, to do particular tasks. Things such as tools, things such as information. Sometimes resources come in the form of other people, but it's not difficult to see that if we have responsibilities such as our job, tasks, and other things that we have to do at the job, we need some kind of resources, whether those resources come from us or from others or from things. Resources are an important part in order for us to be able to fulfill the demands that come with our jobs. When we have good resources, whatever the form of those resources, we are much better equipped to do our jobs and to do them well. So think of a computer, something that most of you use every day at work. If you have a good machine that runs well and that does whatever tasks you need it to do, you're better able to do your job, to complete certain work-related tasks. But if you have a computer that fails you, maybe it crashes on a regular basis, maybe it's slow, maybe it simply isn't up to par, it can become more of a hindrance than a resource. And a computer is just an example. We can think of any tools that can fall into that resource category. So if you had a hammer and that was a brand new hammer and worked like a hammer is supposed to work, then by all means that is a resource when you need a hammer. But if that hammer is falling apart and every time you try to swing it, it goes flying or parts of it go flying, now it becomes a liability, a hindrance, and a source of frustration rather than a resource for you to be able to complete your work. While resources have always been important, especially when we talk about work-related resources or job resources, because that's what allows you to do your job, to perform the tasks related to your job. The resources that we may have taken for granted or may have assumed would always be available may not be as readily available, if at all, in a post-pandemic world. Some of you may be very familiar with lacking resources in this new post-pandemic world. For example, have you tried to purchase a car? Many dealership lots are empty or very limited in their inventory. And if you order a car so that you can buy the exact vehicle that you want, you may be left with months and months and months of waiting. So this is something that has become part of our new reality, and it's not only limited to our buying experience for our personal lives. This is just as important and just as significant in the business world. So resources that may have been much more readily available to you at work may no longer be there, or it may take a long time to secure those resources, or it may be a very inconsistent availability in terms of the resources that you need for work. Although we often think of resources in terms of tangible things, tools, resources aren't limited to things only. Resources can be people or information. So let's say that you require certain information or certain knowledge, certain data in order to complete a task or to do your job, and you don't have that information or that data. You are then lacking the resource that is required for you to complete your task, to do your job. It's the same thing with people. People can be a resource for you, and if a certain person that you need in order to complete your task is not available, then you are again lacking a required resource to do your job, to fulfill that job-related demand. So just as your computer or your tools can be your resource or can be thought of as your resource, so too can your teammates and your boss be seen as a resource. When we consider resources in terms of our work experience, as I already mentioned, the concept is often thought of or presented in terms of job demands and job resources. You need one to complete the other. They go together, a little bit like peanut butter and jelly or peas and carrots, whichever analogy you like. But there is more to resources that can be useful at work than simply job resources. Personal resources can come in handy as well. Let me explain what I mean. If you have personal resources outside of the workplace, so perhaps you have strong supportive relationships, or you have the availability of information or tools or any other resources that you may draw upon and then use that to complete your work tasks or to help you deal with work stressors, then that's a personal resource that can contribute to you being able to be successful at work. So when we talk about job-related resources, those can also come in the form of personal resources, especially if they can benefit you at work in one way or another. As you can imagine, the more resources that you have, whether they're strictly job resources or a combination of job resources and personal resources, the bigger your resource toolbox, the better equipped you are to complete your tasks at work and to deal with whatever comes your way at work. Having proper resources can affect us in so many ways. It can affect things like morale and motivation, things like productivity. Lacking proper resources can lead to things like frustration and stress at work. It may even cause people to leave a company. Considering the importance of resources and their significance, their ability to affect us either for the better or for worse, it's not difficult to understand why proper resources at the workplace are important for both employees and employers. The best way to address the idea of resources at work is through open and honest communications. It's best to avoid assumptions. Sometimes things get lost in the mix because both parties are assuming that the other is either taking care of something, or if nothing is said, then nothing is needed by default. But that's not necessarily the case. So employees have the responsibility of speaking up and asking for resources that they require to do their jobs. Just as employers have the responsibility of knowing what it is that their employees need. And how do you know what your employees need? One of the best way to find out is to ask. Be engaged with the workforce and be aware of what it is that they need to do their jobs. Sometimes the employer needs to take it a step further. Rather than leaving it solely to the employee to figure out what it is that they need, the employer needs to engage in a little more investigative type of activity where they can look into what would make work more efficient, more perhaps enjoyable, and perhaps even such that it creates a healthier, happier, more engaged, and more productive workforce. So beyond simply communicating with employees and getting the basics of what they need, the employer has the responsibility of figuring out what will make for a better work experience. And oftentimes that may include figuring out new resources that may be helpful to employees before employees even know that, one, they need such resources, or even that such resources exist. As you can see, both sides need to be proactive and communicate about this topic openly. It's important to remember that there's a difference between a needed resource and a wanted resource. And both employees and employers need to recognize the difference. And remember that one man's need may be another man's want. So that can vary from person to person, from situation to situation. And when we consider the possible limitations in terms of resources and what may be available in this post-pandemic world, it is helpful to understand if you as an individual employee or if you as the employer are looking at a basic need, something that really needs to be provided versus a want, something that would be nice to have. Basic needs should be on top of the list of what we try to get and make available for the employee, whereas wants don't have the same sense of urgency. And while we should ideally still aim to get the wants as appropriate and as available, they certainly will not have the same sense of urgency. So whether you're the employee or the employer, it's important to distinguish between the needs and the wants, because one, your approach will be different to making the request for this specific resource if you're the employee, and if you're the employer, you will have a different way of response in terms of, do I need to get this for the employee, and how quickly do I need to get this for them? So it's important to distinguish between the two, because where there is clarity, there is less chance of frustration. If you as the employee don't recognize something that's purely a want rather than a true need, but the employer sees it as purely a want and not anything that they will bend over backwards to get for you, especially if it's not readily available, there may be discord between the two of you, perhaps even resentment that results in that situation. So this is where clarity and proper communication are key and can come very handy to avoid any possible misunderstandings, resentments, or other trouble. When we think of job demands and job resources, and as I already said, those two go together, it seems like such a straightforward, simple topic. And really, it is. At the very core of it, it really is. We all have things that we need to get done at work. Those are the demands. And in order to do those things, to complete those tasks, to do our jobs, we need to have a variety of resources. sometimes those resources come from us, sometimes those resources are external to us, and sometimes those are even personal resources that we're able to draw upon in order to be able to complete our work in a more productive or better way, or to have better work experiences, or to better deal with stress at work. So while it's a simple concept, there are many ways of tapping into resources, which is why this is such an important topic of conversation. And now, in a post-pandemic world where we are experiencing all kinds of shortages or extended lead times or delays or irregularities in availability that we haven't experienced before, this is yet another reason why open communication needs to be part of the experience. And that means that both employees and employers have an equal responsibility to keep the communications going and talk about what resources are needed, what resources are wanted, and what can be done to make the work experience the best one possible. Not only do we want it to be a work experience where the employee is productive and engaged, we also want an employee that is happy and healthy and looking forward to continued employment with that organization. So lots to consider for both employees and employers. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Job demands and job resources go together. And when we consider the importance of job resources and how they can affect the employee and collectively the organization, it gives us all the more reason to open communications on this topic. As we face a new and perhaps more challenging reality in terms of resources in a post-pandemic world, that may make things a little more difficult, maybe sometimes a little more frustrating for some people. But this is all the more reason why communications need to be open, honest, and ongoing between employees and employers. Just as employees can draw upon their own resources, their personal resources, and resources that are external to them, so too employers need to consider all of those resources and provide as many of them as possible to their employees, because after all, the success of an employee and the success of an organization are not that far removed. They're quite intertwined. If an employee has the necessary resources to do their job well, then it leads to a stronger organization where collectively the workforce, which is what makes up the bulk of the organization, will promote a stronger, more stable company in general. So resources are an important consideration, whether you're an individual employee or whether you're the employer. As the week unfolds, I invite you to think of your experience, your work experience in terms of your job demands and job resources. Think about what kind of resources you have, what kind of resources you're lacking, and the difference between what you need versus what you want. And as an employer, you need to think of those same things in terms of what is needed for your employees. And you have to take it a step further and think beyond what their initial responses may be in terms of what they need and want. Because as an organization, it's really up to you to think forward and think about what kinds of resources can we provide for our employees that will make their experience better, that will make them more productive, more engaged, and provide or result in a happier, healthier workforce overall. So both parties have lots to consider as the week unfolds, and I really invite you to engage in this kind of contemplation and then open the communication, start the conversation so that things can get moving and resources can be put in place so that everybody can do their jobs well and succeed. After all, nothing more frustrating than lacking resources or inefficient resources when you know you could do a better job, you know your employees could do a better job, but there are no resources in place to allow for that. So everybody has the responsibility to think about what the current situation is and how it can be improved, and then to get those conversations going in a way that will be most productive. If you're experiencing this podcast in an audio-only version, I invite you to check out my YouTube channel, which has the podcast in a video version. In addition to the podcast, my YouTube channel also has videos related to stress management. You can check out my YouTube channel at the link that is provided in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.